long. So thank you for joining. I'll keep this fairly short and sweet. It's just a quick introduction to managing your insurance this year and beyond. As a member of Council of the Somali Organisations, I've been in talks with various people at the organisation, and it's come to an agreement that Scrutton Bland, that's who I work for, you can see our logo on the bottom left, we're going to work in conjunction with the Council of the Somali Organisations to provide another benefit as a member at no extra cost. We'll talk more about kind of features and benefits as we go through, but first we'll do an introduction to who we are, Scrutton Bland, where we're from, what we stand for, and what kind of insurances you should be thinking about for your organisations. Now, there will be points in here that may not be applicable, but what I've done is I've curated the presentation to kind of encapsulate what I think the thought process should be behind for small businesses, small organisations, up to the larger ones as well. So there'll be I can circulate this round with the organisation and ultimately to you members. But yes, so thank you again for joining. So my name is Richard Atkinson. I am a charity insurance executive here at Scrutton Bland. You can see my details on the screen there and my awful picture. And I've been with Scrutton Bland for nearly 9 years, and I am I've kind of worked my way through up to the charity team. There's 8 of us in the charity team, but we don't just do insurance. I do, but the business doesn't. We're based in Ipswich in Suffolk, and we have a number of different offices as well. We deal with organisations, small organisations up to multi-million-pound turnover organisations as well nationwide. So a little bit about Scrutton Bland, as most people might not have heard about us. We essentially secure both business and personal financial futures. We pride ourselves on delivering clarity, compliance, efficiency, and also long-term strategies across all arms of our business. Talking of arms of business and what we offer audit, accountancy, tax, corporate finance, but we also include obviously insurance to startups, to SMEs, corporate, as well as individuals, ranging from Bury St Edmunds, Cambridge, Colchester, Diss and Ipswich offices as well. But we deal with everyone up and down the country. So our services, like I said, we deal with all of these shown on the screen here, but I predominantly deal with insurance, which is this umbrella on the bottom left here. But if you are interested in any of the other kind of offerings, by all means, do get in touch. My details will be circulated, I believe, and will be available on a website on a dedicated page. So by all means, get in contact and we can have a look at other risks as well as insurance. So I think one of the main messages we like to kind of tell people or inform people of is this one here, which you can see. Insurance won't prevent an incident, but it can protect you from financial and reputational liability. But the ultimate question is what cover do you need? Again, you won't need all of these. You may not need all of these. However, it's worth looking at it on a business continuity plan basis, but also at management and trustee board level. So we'll kick off with business interruption and terrorism. So terrorism isn't usually included as standard on insurance policies. So we're talking combined insurance policies, your main annual 12-month insurance policy for your organisation. Again, just before we crack on though, we're talking about CIC, CIOs, registered charities, unregistered charities, social clubs, charity shops, everything under that third sector umbrella. It's an additional cover which you may need to consider to protect you against the costs of a terrorist attack. And those types of risks, or what the insurer would pay out for or will look to pay out for via a claim, is direct damage to your property, loss of income. So say if there was a terrorist event and you had to stop trading, then a loss adjuster would be appointed after the event to look at what the damage would be in terms of financial for your income. Sorry. Also, additional cost in respect of material damage, i.e., getting you set up somewhere else. Say if you were purely operating from an office and you could no longer work from that building, your business interruption would look to place you somewhere else over an agreed amount of time. So that's over 12 months, or it could be 18, 24 months, etc. And then general business interruption, talking about things like flood, or if the building had to be closed down, if there was works being done, any unforeseen circumstance which made it impossible to work from a building and stop trading, your business interruption would cover that. So we always like to say to consider these risks when preparing your business continuity plan. Your auditors, if you have them, can review a risk management plan, but we also can review them here as well at Scrutton Bland. So moving on from business interruption and terrorism, probably a main one that all organisations would most likely hold is public liability. So in a nutshell, public liability insurance can protect you from the impact of the injury or death to a third party or damage to a third party property. And additional covers you may need to be considered are kind of below as well. And I said this before the recording, so I should probably mention it now. This isn't one size fits all. So I like to promote the open dialogue and to have the conversation about what insurance each organization needs, because it's, every organization has differing needs. So essentially, there's under the public liability section, we also have abuse. So if you work with children or vulnerable adults, there are increases to the risks and costs presented to that organisation. Also, legal costs for abuse and compensation in the event of negligence are also a threat, and reputational risk as well. And the cost of professional PR and crisis management can be expensive. So say if there was an abuse event and it came out, it went to press, or it went on social media, which often happens, then you have your public liability policy, which can pick up some, if not all, of the costs related to that. Also, if there's any kind of fundraising going on, it's worth noting that insurers may restrict the cover of standard activities such as walks, balls, fetes, and coffee mornings, for example, and impose limits on the number of attendees. So it's also worth checking with your current providers to make sure, sorry, there's someone else, to make sure that if you're doing larger events or any higher risk events within the UK, just to make sure to speak to your insurers and see if you're adequately covered. And it's always worth checking to make sure that your fundraising team are aware of the cover and the restrictions in place, and just to ensure that full risk assessments are also in place for each event. So in the event of a claim, say if someone was to gain an injury while on a walk or a coffee morning, even for those smaller events, it is well worth doing risk assessments, and risk assessments can be found, or the template for the risk assessments can be found, on the .gov website or the health and safety website. It's all free to do, but we always promote filing of those and making sure that they're adequately in place. So moving on from those points, it's also worth double checking if any of your staff or volunteers travel abroad. You should consider you should make sure that there's adequate cover in place in terms of travel insurance and personal liability. Not all policies include that. A lot of our policies that we source do have that in place, but it's also worth having that discussion with your current insurer to make sure that they are covered. Also, if there's any property owner risk, if you own land or ground, it is your responsibility to ensure that it is always in a good state of repair and has a maintenance program in place as well. And then products liability, not one that we often see a need for in the third sector, but nevertheless it does exist. It's a compulsory cover for charity shops. This protects you against the liability for deaths or injury to a member of the public or third parties property due to a product you supply. Charity shops, again, do require this cover, even though they're donated goods. Things like PAT testing should be done for electrical items. Clothing should be cleaned adequately, etc. So, moving on from public liability then, we also look at sourcing employers' liability, which also covers for volunteers. So paid members of staff are covered, and also your volunteers too. Whilst employers are required by law to insure against liability for injury to their employees, the same is not true for volunteers. However, it's worth bringing up the conversation internally about how you would be protected if a volunteer made a claim against you, or if a third party made a claim against a volunteer. Say, for instance, there was damages involved or injury involved. You know, volunteers do need to be considered too. It's also a very important point to bring up is, can you prove that you operate in adherence to the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974? But furthermore, manual handling is also a common liability exposure, and training should be provided and recorded. Do you have adequate safeguarding policies in place, and are volunteers vetted? So while they're not paid members of staff, insurers do expect the same level of procedure, vetting, and policies to be in place to make sure that those volunteers are protected, but also those people dealing with those volunteers are also adequately protected. So in terms of liability examples, I've done some fairly generic ones. Again, these may not be directly relevant. However, just to give you an example, one of your employees caught their cardigan on a railing and tripped up whilst working at a service user's property and injured their arm. So in this case, it wouldn't be covered as there was no negligence and this was a human error. So to pause that for a second, employer's liability there, that covers your employees and your volunteers, is there to protect to pay towards claims that are a result from the organisation's negligence. If it's a human error, it will not be covered. But if the organisation hasn't done something that they needed to, i.e. health and safety or proper instructions to the volunteer or employee, then your employer's liability will come into play. Another example is a volunteer suffers from anxiety and stress due to the nature of the care work undertaken as part of their role. So, for example, this could be any kind of therapy roles or any role which would result in that worker being exposed to potential stressful content. That could be media or discussions with service users. The result would mean that they're covered under the employer's liability policy because it's a loss occurring. This means you are covered by the policy that was in force when an event actually occurred. So, for example, and this is also worth remembering, if you move to a new insurer and a claim is received for the previous year, the claim will be directed. So it's when it happened, it's on an occurrence basis. So that's why it's important to make sure you've got employer's liability and a clear path as to who those insurers were and just a record essentially. Another important cover, it's one that we're seeing a lot more focus on at the moment, mainly because without trustee liability, the trustees and management, their own assets are at risk if there was any kind of wrongdoing and there wasn't cover in place. So again, in a nutshell, and to put it briefly, trustee indemnity insurance covers the legal costs and expenses of defending against disqualification of a trustee, investigations or extradition proceedings, and can protect the trustee's personal wealth. So an example of this is alleged defamation, which we do see here at Scrutton Bland. We do have claims of this nature presenting themselves. So, for example, following the publication of an article, the charity trustees were sued for defamation by another charity with similar objectives. The claimant stated that certain statements made in the article were untrue and gave a false representation of the charity. So again, this is where your trustees' indemnity would come into play. This is for claims brought against individuals or members of management and not the entity, corporation or organisation. And another example is claim for alleged trespass. This one's a little bit more far-fetched, but we'll stick with it. A neighbouring landowner to the charity claimed that recent construction carried out by the charity infringed on their property. The charity claimed their documents showed that the previous owner passed the land over to them, whereas the claimant argued that the land never legally belonged to the previous owner. Trustees were, in this instance, responsible for damages and for the restoring the land to its former condition. Again, this is where your trustee liability would come into play. The way in which I work is presenting the type of cover, and it really is down to the trustees to make that decision to what the amount should be. When you have a discussion, for instance, with myself, we can have a further conversation about the price implications of different levels of cover. We can have that discussion. That's not a problem at all. So moving on from professional indemnity then, moving on from trustee indemnity, we have professional indemnity. Now, professional indemnity is vitally important for charities, as well as it is for commercial organisations too. So the third sector organisations, we do see an exposure here with quite a few. It's especially prevalent with organisations that do, advice. They could do form filling for people. If there's money advice happening as well, it could be for housing association, that kind of thing. Any advice given doesn't need to be professional advice. Given the name, I know that's probably a little bit confusing. Any advice given, this is where professional indemnity will come into play. It's to cover against professional negligence, providing incorrect advice, loss of documents or data, unintentional breach of copyright and or confidentiality, so GDPR, and defamation and libel, and also loss of goods or money, which could mean your own or for which you are responsible for. So it does have quite a broad spectrum of cover. But again, like I said, with the trustees indemnity, it's about identifying whether or not your organisation does need it or doesn't need it. We then go on to, I won't spend too much time on this one. This cover is employment practice liability. Employment practice liability provides cover for legal costs and in respect of an employment claim. So, for instance, we'll go on to what you'd do in the event of an employment claim. Question to ask is, do you have a HR advisor or do you outsource to a specialist company or solicitors? If not, you really should consider employment practices cover. If you're outsourcing, they most likely will have their own insurance. So if there was a claim brought forward, it would then go to your HR provider. If you don't, then we would certainly recommend this type of cover. Legal expenses are also covered, which provides protection against costs, obviously prospect of success included. And but it's worth noting that cover in isolation, meaning if you were to get employment practice liability on its own, does have a higher excess of up to 5,000 with no prospect of success. So there's plenty to think about. We can bolt it onto policies if you would like it, but also we can look at it in isolation, but there are higher excesses involved usually. So a claim example for employment practice liability, an employment law protection insurance, allegation of constructive dismissal. This is something that we do see fairly regularly. A community support worker, for instance, claimed constructive dismissal because the charity he worked for allegedly failed to deal with his concerns about his working arrangements, which he says made it impossible for him to continue working. One allegation was that he had not received training in working with paranoid schizophrenics. So applying it to other examples, a disgruntled employee makes a claim towards the business. If you don't have employment practice liability and you don't have a HR department, outsourced HR with their own insurance, the potential for the costs are quite high. So it's that added layer of protection against employees or volunteers making claims against the organisation. So a bit of a hot topic at the moment, unfortunately, is cyber insurance. So new risks are emerging in the form of cybercrime, unfortunately. We're seeing an uptick in claims, mainly born from the pandemic, where everyone pretty much moved to an online presence. We're talking emails, invoices being paid, Teams, Outlook, CRMs, anything that you do online became more focused over the pandemic and beyond, as hybrid working is becoming more popular in some respect. But because of this, it can have significant impact on reputational risk and have cost implications, much like any other insurance. Cyber, just giving you a very brief rundown of this, cyber cover can provide a defense against costs such as data breach. So if you hold lots of data of members of your organization or clients or providers, any sensitive information, email addresses, bank details, etc., cyber insurance will cover to reinstate the data, but also deal with the fallout from that, which we'll go into in a second. Damage to data or programs. So if a hacker came in and damaged your CRM, then or your Outlook, then your cyber insurance would pay to restore it back to being operational. Network failure, that's the same as damage to data, but on a network basis. Cyber extortion and ransomware. There is one of the main threats at the moment is for even smaller organizations where a cyber criminal will come in, install ransomware onto the network or your laptops or your PCs and will not release access to it until the ransom is paid. With a cyber insurance policy, there's a team of cyber specialists who will negotiate with the cyber criminal, but also look to restore everything back to normal, while dealing with, in some cases, higher kind of police bodies to make sure that that person is kind of chased after appropriately, and cyber terrorism as well, and breaches of payment card industry data security standard. Essentially, if you take payment details over the phone, if there's a breach, then the cyber insurance will cover and mitigate damages from that as well. So kind of to round things off then, we like to think of that the insurance is kind of your final protection, your final bubble protection. The key to managing risks for charities is protection and assurance that you have the correct cover. So as part of benefit to members, it'll be myself as the main point of contact. But it's having that discussion about ensuring that you understand insurance, but also how you understand it, how it's applicable to your organization and business. I think it's safe to say that it's not always the top of people's lists, which is really understandable, given how many risks charities face, but also time management, and also the world of insurance can be quite confusing for some. Alongside that, it's always best to consult a charity specialist such as myself, who understands the covers that can save you time and give you peace of mind that you're protected correctly. It's also taking out the stress of finding insurance, and if a claim was brought forward, then you have someone to kind of help you through the whole process here. So that's pretty much it from me. So what I'll do is I will stop sharing my screen